To grasp the original meaning of this portion of the primeval history, it will help to consider two matters. First, we will see how Moses connected this portion of his primeval history to Israel's experience. And second, we will explore the implications of these connections for Moses' original Israelite readers. Let's look first at the ways Moses connected these chapters to the experiences of the Israelites whom he was leading. Moses related these chapters of his primeval history to his contemporary world by describing the violence of early human history in ways that closely resembled the experiences of violence which Israel had endured. By doing so, he pointed out that the troubles which Israel faced were very similar to the troubles of the primeval world. Now, to explore how Moses established these similarities, we will look once again at the two major sections of Genesis chapter 4 verse 1 through chapter 6 verse 8. The first scenario of early violence and hope of deliverance in chapters 4 and 5, and the second scenario of later violence and hope of deliverance in chapter 6 verses 1 through 8. Let's look first at how Genesis chapters 4 and 5 connected to Israel's experience. As we look at the characteristics of the wicked and the righteous in Genesis chapters 4 and 5, it becomes apparent that Moses shaped this material so that his readers would associate Cain and his family with the Egyptians, and so that they would associate righteous Abel, Seth, and the Sethites with themselves as the people of God. Now, how did Moses build these connections? We should begin by examining the story of sinful Cain in Genesis chapter 4 verses 1 through 16. In this story, Moses focused on at least 5 concerns that allow the Israelites to connect this passage to their own day. In the first place, Moses mentioned the occupations of Cain and Abel to create these associations. Listen to the way Cain and Abel were initially distinguished in Genesis chapter 4 verse 2. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. As this passage indicates, Cain was a settled agriculturalist, a farmer, while Abel was a shepherd. In ancient and modern times, it has been common for tensions to arise between settled agriculturally based societies and nomadic shepherds. And as the book of Genesis itself indicates, Moses and the Israelites were quite aware of this kind of tension and how it led to serious trials while they were in Egypt. In Genesis chapter 46, verses 33 and 34, Joseph instructed his brothers in this way when they came to Egypt. When Pharaoh calls you in and asks, "What is your occupation?" you should answer, "Your servants have tended livestock from our boyhood on, just as our fathers did. Then you will be allowed to settle in the region of Goshen, for all shepherds are detestable to the Egyptians." Joseph's instructions here give us insight into why Moses mentioned that Cain was a farmer and Abel a shepherd. He wanted his Israelite readers to associate Cain, the agriculturalist, with the Egyptians, and he wanted Israel to associate themselves with Abel, the victimized shepherd. A second connection between this story and Moses' original audience appears in the motif of the sacrifices offered by Cain and Abel. As Genesis chapter 4 tells us, God rejected Cain's sacrifice, but was pleased with Abel's sacrifice. The reason for God's distinctions between these sacrifices is made explicit in Genesis chapter 4, verses 3 and 4, where we read these words. Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, but Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. Notice the way Moses described the sacrifices. In verse 3, he said that Cain offered some of the fruits of the soil. But in verse 4, he wrote that Abel offered fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. This distinction is very important. Cain simply brought whatever fruits of his field he happened to gather. His worship was nominal at best because he did not reserve the best of his crop for God. But Abel fulfilled the law of God with a sincere heart by bringing the fat portions, which were highly prized for Old Testament sacrifices, from among the firstborn of his flocks, which were the most highly prized animals according to the law of Moses. Cain's sacrifice was little more than an insincere ritual, but by contrast, Abel offered sincere devotion to God. Moses also used this distinction between the sacrifices of Cain and Abel to draw further associations with the Egyptians and Israel. This background is striking when we remember that Moses first approached Pharaoh to ask for the release of Israel because he wanted to offer sacrifices to Yahweh. As we read in Exodus chapter 5, verse 3, Moses and Aaron said these words to Pharaoh: "The God of the Hebrews has met with us. Now let us take a 3-day journey into the desert to offer sacrifices to the Lord our God." But Pharaoh refused their request. As Moses recorded in verse 4, Pharaoh told them, "Moses and Aaron, why are you taking the people away from their labor? Get back to your work." So we see that just as Cain had dishonored God with his nominal sacrifices, the Egyptians did not offer true worship to Israel's God. Yet just as Abel offered sincere and acceptable sacrifices, so the Israelites sought the true worship of Yahweh. In this way, Moses established another association of Egypt with Cain and of Israel with Abel. A third way Moses created connections with Israel's experience was through the motif of murder. Cain murdered his brother Abel, and the significance of this event becomes evident when we remember the murders of the Israelites that took place in Egypt. In Exodus chapters 1 and 2, we read that the Egyptians not only overworked the Israelites, but actively murdered many of them, including their infant children. In this way, Moses developed still more associations between Cain and the Egyptians, as well as between Abel and the Israelites. A fourth way in which Moses created these associations was by describing Cain's location on the earth. When God cursed Cain for murdering Abel, he banished Cain from the fertile land. As we read in Genesis chapter 4, verses 11 and 12, "Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you." Cain was cursed to live in places where his farming would yield very little produce. This description of Cain's location fit nicely with Moses' assessment of the land of Egypt and of the land where he was taking Israel. Listen to the way Moses contrasted Canaan and Egypt in Deuteronomy chapter 11, verses 10 through 12. "The land you are entering to take over is not like the land of Egypt from which you have come, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by foot as in a vegetable garden. But the land you are crossing the Jordan to take possession of is a land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. It is a land the Lord your God cares for." God sent Cain to a place far from Eden, to a place like Egypt, where farming required much effort. This fact was another way in which Moses' Israelite readers were to associate Cain with the Egyptians. A fifth way in which Genesis chapters 4 and 5 connected Cain with Egypt and Abel with Israel was in the theme of Cain's protection. Even though Cain killed his brother Abel, God still protected him from harm. We read these words from God in Genesis chapter 4, verse 15. "If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over." God protected Cain from harm even though he was a murderer. Once again, we see that Moses described these events so that Israel would associate them with their own experience in Egypt. God had given great protection to Egypt, even though they were murderous and deserved divine judgment. For a long time, God extended special protection to Egypt. So we see that in at least 5 ways, Moses established meaningful parallels between this primeval period and Israel's Exodus experience. The themes of occupations, worship, murder, location, and protection all indicate that Moses wanted his Israelite readers to apply this story to their lives by associating Cain with the Egyptians and by associating Abel with themselves as the people of God. Now that we have seen the associations established in the story of sinful Cain, we should turn to the parallel narrative concerning righteous Seth in Genesis chapter 4, verses 25 and 26. As we have seen, Moses made one significant comment about Seth and his son Enosh. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, we read these words, "At that time, men began to call on the name of the Lord." Moses mentioned this fact about Seth and his son so that his readers would identify themselves not only with Abel, but also with Seth, Adam's son, who replaced Abel. In the first place, Seth used the divine name Yahweh. And this use of the name Yahweh associated him with Israel. Interestingly enough, the book of Exodus makes it clear that the name Yahweh rose to prominence in the days of Moses. For example, God spoke to Moses in this way in Exodus chapter 3, verse 15. "Say to the Israelites, the Lord," in Hebrew Yahweh, "the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name by which I am to be remembered from generation to generation." Although the biblical record indicates that the name Yahweh was used from the time of Seth, during the time of Moses, this name became the principal name used for God. For this reason, faithful Israelites under Moses' leadership would have associated themselves with righteous Seth. Like him, they also cherished the name Yahweh. In the second place, the Israelites should have associated themselves with Seth through the theme of prayer. This motif also appears in Genesis chapter 4, verse 26, where Moses wrote that Seth's family began to call on the name of the Lord. In the Old Testament, to call on the name of the Lord often meant to cry out for divine help in a time of trouble or need. In this light, we can see that Moses drew a second connection to Israel in his own times. From the rest of the Pentateuch, we learn that in the Exodus from Egypt, Israel called on Yahweh for help during many crises, much like Seth and Enosh had called on him. So we see that Moses designed the narratives about sinful Cain and righteous Seth to form parallels with his contemporary world. He wanted his readers to notice that the Egyptians were like Cain. He also wanted his readers to see that they themselves were like Abel and Seth. With these basic connections in mind, we're in a position to turn to the genealogy of Cain and the genealogy of Seth. As we will see, Moses also shaped these genealogies so that the Israelites would continue to associate the Egyptians with the wicked and themselves with the righteous. To further his main purpose, Genesis chapter 4, verses 17 through 24 characterizes the line of Cain in ways that drew indisputable associations with Egypt. These connections appear in at least 6 ways. First, Moses focused on Cain as a city builder. As he wrote in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, Cain was then building a city. Needless to say, the Israelites knew all too well that the Egyptians were great city builders. Building cities for the Egyptians had been part of what the Israelites did as they were slaves in Egypt. For this reason, these words about Cain would have created strong associations with the Egyptians. Second, we should also take note of the name of Cain's city. Again, in Genesis chapter 4, verse 17, we read these words, "Cain was then building a city, and he named it after his son Enoch." For Israelites in the days of Moses, this fact reminded them of an Egyptian practice. As Moses reported in Exodus chapter 1, verse 11, the Egyptians put slave masters over the Israelites to oppress them with forced labor, and they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. The city Ramses was named in honor of the Pharaoh Ramses. Just like Cain, the Egyptians also named cities after themselves for their own glory and honor. In this way, Cain's genealogy established another connection between Cain and the Egyptians. A third association between Cain's line and Egypt appears in the pride which Cain's descendant Lamech took in his act of murder. In chapter 4, verse 23, we read that Lamech actually sang a song of praise to himself before his wives. Adah and Zillah, listen to me. Wives of Lamech, hear my words. I have killed a man for wounding me. Lamech's boasting of his atrocities should have associated Lamech with the Egyptians in the minds of the ancient Israelites. The Israelites would have been quite aware that many ancient Egyptian inscriptions praised the pharaohs and their armies for their murderous exploits. A fourth association appears in Moses' attention to the death of children. Listen again to what Lamech said. In chapter 4, verse 23, we read, I have killed a man for wounding me, a young man for injuring me. The Hebrew term translated young man here is yeled, which is often translated simply boy. One of Lamech's victims was in all likelihood little more than a child. As we all know, in the first chapter of the book of Exodus, Pharaoh ordered the death of Israelite boys. Like Cain's Lamech, the Egyptians struck out against the defenseless of Israel, against their male children. A fifth association between Cain's family and the Egyptians appears in Lamech's claim to increased protection. In Genesis chapter 4, verse 24, Lamech claimed to enjoy even more protection than Cain. If Cain is avenged 7 times, then Lamech 77 times. Just as Lamech thought that God protected him, the pharaohs of Egypt were confident of protection from their gods. As a matter of fact, it had certainly appeared for many years that the Egyptians enjoyed more and more protection from harm. In the sixth place, we should note the cultural sophistication of Cain's line. Listen to the ways these 3 Cainite brothers, Jabal, Jubal, and Tubal-Cain, are described in Genesis chapter 4, verses 20 through 22. Jabal was the father of those who live in tents and raise livestock. Jubal was the father of all who play the harp and flute. Tubal-Cain forged all kinds of tools out of bronze and iron. With these words, Moses characterized Cain's family as very sophisticated. Jabal was no mere shepherd. He invented animal husbandry. Jubal invented music, and Tubal-Cain invented sophisticated metallurgy. It would have been very difficult for Israelites in Moses' day to have missed this connection. Compared to the simple nomadic lifestyles of Israel's patriarchs, the culture of Egypt was highly sophisticated. Moses described the sinful line of Cain in this way to confirm the association he wanted his readers to make between Cain's lineage and the Egyptians. So we see that in at least 6 ways, Moses drew connections between the Cainite genealogy and the Egyptians. His descriptions of city building, naming cities, pride in murder, violence against children, divine protection, and cultural sophistication in Cain's family were designed to create these connections. Now we should turn to the genealogy of Seth in Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 through 32. As we might expect, Moses constructed the Sethite genealogy so that his Israelite readers would identify themselves with Seth's lineage. This association was built on at least 4 factors. In the first place, we should note that on a biological level, the nation of Israel descended from the line of Seth. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 32, we read the names of Noah's 3 sons. After Noah was 500 years old, he became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. The name Shem was particularly important to Moses because Shem was the ancestor of Israel. In modern languages, we derive the term Semitic or Semite from the name Shem. Although other nations also came from the seed of Shem, the Israelites were God's special chosen people, and they were from among the descendants of Shem. So in this simple biological sense, Moses connected his Israelite readers with Seth's genealogy. A second association between Seth's line and Israel appears in the repeated focus on the righteousness of Seth's descendants. Seth's line is characterized as faithful and righteous. For instance, according to Genesis chapter 5, verse 24, Enoch walked with God, then he was no more. In the Hebrew Bible, the expression translated walked with God only occurs with reference to Enoch and Noah. Yet time and again, especially in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses told Israel that they were to be like Enoch by walking in the ways of Yahweh. In this way, the faithful Israelites following Moses found another point of identification with the line of Seth. It was their goal to be like Enoch. A third connection between Seth's genealogy and Israel's experience appears in Moses' emphasis on the numbers of Sethites. In Seth's genealogy, we learn that his descendants became quite numerous. Moses brought out the numerical increase of Seth's family by repeating the fact that other sons and daughters were born to the Sethites. In fact, he wrote this comment 9 times in Genesis chapter 5. This emphasis on numbers of people in Seth's line was significant for Moses' Israelite readers because they knew that God had greatly blessed them numerically while in Egypt and during the Exodus. In the fourth place, Moses also stressed the long lives that many Sethites enjoyed in order to connect Israel with the Sethites. For example, we all know that Seth's descendant Methuselah lived longer than anyone in biblical history. According to Genesis chapter 5, verse 27, he lived 969 years. Many other Sethites lived long lives as well. Moses' attention to the long lives of Seth's line was important because, as the law of Moses indicates, long life in the land of promise was to be the goal of the faithful in Israel. By pointing out the long lives of Seth's descendants, Moses drew another connection between the Sethites and Israel. So it is that Moses wrote about the early violence and hope of deliverance in the primeval history in order to draw firm associations with his contemporary world. Cain and his descendants were to be connected with the Egyptians who inflicted violence on Israel. And Abel, Seth, and Seth's descendants were to be connected with the Israelites who were the victims of Egyptian violence. These associations were at the heart of Moses' strategy in this portion of his history. Now that we've seen how Moses handled his record of early violence and hope, we should turn briefly to Genesis chapter 6, verses 1 through 8, later violence and the hope of deliverance. Let's look especially at chapter 6, verse 4. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of men and had children by them. They were the heroes of old, men of renown. We have already noted that the Nephilim were mighty warriors, well known for their exploits. But notice that Moses made an important comment about the Nephilim. He said that the Nephilim existed on earth in the primeval days and also afterward. By adding this allusion to Nephilim warriors living after the flood, Moses reminded his Israelite readers that they had encountered Nephilim in their recent history. The only other place where the term Nephilim appears in the Bible is in Numbers chapter 13, verses 32 through 33. There, the spies Moses sent into Canaan reported seeing Nephilim. They said these words, "The land we explored devours those living in it. We saw the Nephilim there. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The unfaithful spies reported that the land of Canaan was a terribly violent and threatening place, and that among the inhabitants of Canaan were Nephilim, vicious warriors who struck fear into their hearts. Now, unfortunately, this report led the first generation following Moses to turn away from God's call to conquest. And God was so disturbed by this lack of faith that he sent the Israelites into the wilderness to wander aimlessly until the first generation had died off and a new generation was prepared to take up the cause of conquest. In this light, we can understand how Moses drew another strong connection between this portion of his primeval history and the experience of Israel. He wanted his Israelite readers to associate the primeval Nephilim of Genesis chapter 6 with the terrifying Nephilim warriors of Canaan. In this way, the violence and hope of deliverance in Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 8 spoke directly to the threat of violence in the conquest of Canaan. So far in our examination of the original meaning of Genesis chapter 4 verse 1 through chapter 6 verse 8, we have seen the primeval characters associated with people in Israel's contemporary experience. Now we should ask a second question. What were the implications of these associations for the people of Israel as they followed Moses toward the Promised Land? To understand the heart of Moses' message to Israel, we need to remember the basic scenario that appears twice in this material. You will recall that Genesis chapter 4 verse 1 through chapter 6 verse 8 contains two scenarios of violence and hope of deliverance. Chapter 4 verse 1 through chapter 5 verse 32 focused on the violence of Cain and his descendants. Yet chapter 5 verses 29 and 32 mention Noah in order to indicate that deliverance would come through him. In much the same way, just as Genesis chapter 6 verses 1 through 8 report the violence of the sons of God and the Nephilim, Genesis chapter 6 verse 8 mentions Noah once again to indicate that God intended to deliver from these threats as well. For the Israelites following Moses, these scenarios should have been good news. They revealed what God had already done for them and what he was about to do for them. On the one hand, just as God had used Noah to deliver Israel's ancestors from the Canaanites, he had already used Moses to deliver the Israelites from the Egyptians. On the other hand, just as God had used Noah to bring deliverance from the primeval Nephilim, he was about to use Moses to deliver the Israelites as they faced the threat of Nephilim in the land of Canaan.